The heavy metal style emerged in the late 1960s and was codified by 1971, and this paper examines how it was present in the evolution of Black Sabbath's individual style, or idiolect, from 1969 to 1971. This was also the period when Sabbath developed their idiolect through an increased use of progressive rock elements, with their 1972 album being a marked change in this respect. Sabbath is widely present in heavy metal scholarship, but they are nearly absent from the discourse on progressive rock, scholarly and otherwise. They began as a blues band, but their use of blues elements became subtler and less frequent over the course of these 3 years, as elements of metal and prog became more pronounced. Using an approach based on topic theory, I will identify style indicators that signify metal, prog, and blues in Sabbath's music. When a style indicator operates outside of the normative expectations of the prevailing style, it acts as a genre synecdoche representative of that other style. It is important to note that heavy metal as a genre label did not exist during these 3 years and was not commonplace until 1974. The term heavy metal was certainly in use before the music we now call heavy metal existed, and that music was created before the term heavy metal was used to describe it as a genre. The first printed use of heavy metal to describe Black Sabbath was most likely the August 1972 issue of Phonograph Record. Instead of relying on this timeline whether to consider Sabbath's early music to be heavy metal, this paper uses a stylistic definition following heavy metal scholarship. It is also important to note that just because a band is considered to be a part of a genre does not mean that all of the songs in their repertoire would necessarily be in the same style. For example, Children of the Grave is a metal song, but Planet Caravan is not, and yet they were both by a metal band. This concept also applies to passages within the same song. For example, some passages in After Forever sound Beatles-esque and others like metal. The blues was Sabbath's prevailing musical style from 1968 to mid-1969 when they were known as Earth. Metal elements found in the music in 69 to 71 began as genre synecdoches to the blues, but as those elements became more prominent and frequent, metal became Sabbath's prevailing musical style. Ubiquitous in metal are heavy power chord riffs played with distortion, so they function as a style indicator. Although these are found on their first album, songs such as Iron Man and War Pigs from their second album, and After Forever, Children of the Grave, and Sweet Leaf from their third album feature them prominently. The riffs that are arguably the most metal sounding come from their third album, in the songs Children of the Grave and Into the Void, and this is because of their heaviness and crunch due to the palm muting on the lowest string, which is detuned to 3 half steps. Sabbath's emphasis of scale degree flat 5 in songs such as Black Sabbath and Electric Funeral, and their use of the flat 2 chord in The Wizard and War Pigs provide a darkness that signify metal. Although flat 2 is sometimes understood as having come from Phrygian mode, Phrygian-based music was not common at this time. I believe that Sabbath's use of the flat 2 in The Wizard is derived from the common flat 2 to 1 blues ending, like in this example from 1955. I've doctored this Earl King sample to have the same rhythm as The Wizard in order to compare the two. And the Sabbath. The same flat 2 chord is emphasized in War Pigs as well. The use of 2 bass drums is also very common in metal, and although they did not use 2 bass drums until their 1972 album, the overdubbed low drums on the third album are a precursor to that. Here is the isolated drum track. And here it is again with the cymbals EQ'd out. Extremes in tempo is a hallmark in some styles of metal, with Into the Void being the fastest of these three albums at 252 beats per minute. I will count along. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. At 33 beats per minute, the song Black Sabbath is their slowest. A 66 BPM pulse may be felt, but the snare drum implies a halftime feel. I will count and subdivide. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Lyrical topics such as the occult and war, especially when depicted graphically, are also important style indicators for metal, but only when paired with a musical accompaniment that also signifies metal. For instance, bands such as Coven and Black Widow have satanic lyrics, but their music does not sound like metal, so the lyrics alone do not make them a metal band. Similarly, war-themed lyrics were not uncommon for Vietnam War-era music. Think of all the folk rock examples that would never be considered metal because of how they sound. There are also war-themed lyrics found in some progressive rock songs, but these examples would not be considered metal because of the music. However, graphic depictions of war, such as the imagery of atomic war found in Electric Funeral, will signify metal, especially because of the other heavy metal style indicators found in the music. Like heavy metal, progressive rock was not a genre label used in 69 to 71 for bands now considered to be progressive rock, such as King Crimson, Yes, Genesis, etc. Although Sabbath was sometimes described and marketed as progressive, that descriptor had a different meaning than what is implied by the modern use of the term. Anderton and Atten 2020 found that there was little consensus among the British music press in 68 to 74 for the term progressive, and that progressive rock was rarely used to describe bands that are now considered to be progressive rock. I have found that the term progressive rock was largely absent in the US music publications as well. For example, nearly all of the 117 mentions of the term progressive rock in issues of Variety from 68 to 74 refer to the FM radio format, not to bands such as King Crimson, Yes, etc. Some scholars use a much wider definition of prog, one that would include bands such as the Moody Blues, but this paper uses a narrower definition. I do not wish to make the claim that Sabbath was a prog band, but rather to illustrate that elements of prog became more prominent in their idiolect during these years. A similar trend may be found in other progressive rock bands of the time. For instance, Perrin 2005 observes that the first two Yes albums have many elements of pop music, with a change beginning with their third album. Palmer 2001 considers that third album to be Yes's first progressive rock album. Perrin 2005 also observes that 1968 to 69 was a peak time for the formation of prog bands, and that 1970 was a peak year for bands to release their first prog album. This lag is explained by the time it takes for writing, rehearsing, recording, and releasing an album, as well as that prog bands' earliest recordings might not necessarily be considered prog. With Sabbath having formed in 1968, and with their first three albums having less progressive elements than later ones, I see a parallel with their prog contemporaries that have similar formation dates and a similar increase of the use of prog elements over the course of their first 4 or so albums. Prog bands often explore a variety of timbres, especially keyboards, although synthesizers were not yet commonplace in 1969 to 71. As a timeline comparison, Sabbath's first use of synths was around the same time as ELP's Lucky Man and before Yes's Fragile album, and 2 years before Genesis was using synths. Sabbath began to experiment with synth sounds on their second album with the song Planet Caravan, which has a synth, likely an EMS VCS3, and a piano as well. Their third album has a song with flute and piano, a song with a synthesizer drone, and a song with an unknown keyboard, maybe harmonium or mellotron with accordion tapes. I'm not sure, so if you recognize this instrument, please let me know. The ring modulator on Ozzy Osbourne's voice in the beginning of Iron Man signifies prog because it evokes science fiction. I believe this was intentional because a lyric sheet for it labeled it a science fiction song. The same effect was put on the voice of the Daleks in Doctor Who.
Obey the Daleks! You are in our power!
Although none of these examples are performed in a Prog manner, their existence signifies Prog because they function as a genre synecdoche to the prevailing, yet still emerging, style of metal. The evocation of classical music is another signifier of Prog, and only a few examples occur in these early years, such as the classical-like chord progression in Orchid, the quasi-medieval Embryo, or the fingerstyle guitar in Warning, Wicked World, Orchid, and the intro to the song Black Sabbath when performed live. Songs with many different sections are common in Prog, and although it may be argued that this is also true for metal, I would argue that because Sabbath was the model for many later metal bands, metal songs with complex forms are a result of Sabbath's use of Prog elements. There is some disagreement on whether formal complexity is a core aspect of metal. Some say that it is simple and predictable, and others say it is complex. If we temporarily suspend the belief that complex forms are indicative of the heavy metal style, we can then acknowledge the influence of progressive rock. Thus, when a metal song has a simple form, we can consider that normative and with little or no influence of prog. And when complex forms are present in a heavy metal context, we can attribute the progressive rock influence and understand that as signifying the progressive rock style. There are many examples of formal complexity in Sabbath's music, and these are marked by tempo changes, key changes, and multiple riffs used within a song. Chromatic density, another aspect of Prog, was rare in early Sabbath. A riff typically would include only 5 different pitches. The most notable exception from 69 to 71 is the opening riff of Into the Void, in which some chromaticism yields 7 different pitches. Texture is another musical element to consider. Often in Sabbath we find riffs doubled with guitar and bass, sometimes the vocal melody following in unison, and the drums accentuating those rhythms in favor of playing a standard drum beat. This is a focused sound that contributes to the heaviness, and certainly a texture of heavy metal. Contrapuntal textures are more common to Prog, and for Sabbath, these are only found during guitar solos when the bass abandons any chord root emphasis and is improvisatory instead. The drums are also performed freer in these sections, thus creating a texture more like an ensemble trio, instead of guitar solo accompanied by some subordinate bass and timekeeping drummer. Sometimes Sabbath will have 2 simultaneous guitar solos, which creates an even more complex texture. One exceptional example is in War Pigs, where at one point there are 3 guitar solos and 2 bass tracks. Sabbath's contrapuntal textures are found in instrumental sections, as they did not have multiple vocal parts until later albums, and even then, those extra vocal parts were not contrapuntal as one might find in, say, Yes or Gentle Giant. The one aspect of Prog that Sabbath did not explore during this time, one that is especially defining of the style, is asymmetrical meter. All of their music was in either 3 or 4, and the first use of odd time wasn't until 1975. This places Sabbath squarely in the metal style. Like in the case of formal complexity, when metal bands use asymmetrical meters, it signifies Prog. There are stylistic qualities common to metal and Prog, and these may be defined by what they are not, and that is pop music. For instance, pop songs often rely on verse-chorus structures, but that is not the case for metal, nor Prog especially. Lyrics found in pop music are often love-based and sometimes trite, but lyrics in metal and Prog usually explore other topics and have deeper meanings. Some scholarship mentions heavy metal with these lyrical topics, but that repertoire is better understood as being hard rock, not metal. The hard rock-heavy metal dichotomy will not be covered in this paper. Sabbath almost always actively avoided love songs, and if love-related, there would be a twist. For example, in NIB, Lucifer falls in love, and Sweet Leaf is essentially a love letter to cannabis. One could consider the science fiction lyrics of Iron Man to signify prog, but the anger in the lyrics would signify metal. The Lord of the Rings-inspired The Wizard could also signify prog, but mythology-based lyrics may be also found in metal. More importantly, though, these topics are mostly absent from pop lyrics. Sabbath established a non-pop aesthetic by 1970, allowing both metal and prog to become a part of their idiolect. Although they recorded a few pop-style covers in 1969, these songs never became a part of their live repertoire.
Would you leave the unprepared bed? Have a time for someone else? Is your word a soundless heart to pass away the cracker's mouth? If your heart lay with the rebel, would you cheer the underdog?
Blues elements are present in much of pop music, but they are largely absent from prog. And although metal has its roots in the blues, the recontextualization of blues elements in metal is so prevalent that any occurrence of authentic blues will be perceived as a genre synecdoche. Thus, the diminishing of blues in Sabbath's music during these years allowed for both metal and prog to emerge. They formed as a band in 1968, playing mostly blues songs, but these were gradually removed from the setlist. A live recording from November 1969 includes only 3 blues covers. In April 1970, there was only 1, and after that, none. It is notable that their song The Wizard, which features harmonica, an instrument that signifies blues, was likely removed from the setlist sometime in 1969. Ozzy said in December 1970 that he no longer plays harmonica on stage, but that he is considering playing it on their next album. The fact that harmonica was not used on the next album nor in live performances illustrates that it was probably deemed too bluesy for the band at this stage of their stylistic development. Although the blues remained a clear influence on Sabbath's music, its use became subtle, infrequent, and less authentic by 1971. In addition to The Wizard, the passages from the first album that have the clearest connection to the blues are the chord progression for the verses of Behind the Wall of Sleep and the blues shuffle in Warning. Fairies Wear Boots also has a strong blues connection, and although it appears on their second album, parts of it likely date back to 1969. Not only was it performed live before the album was recorded, but there is a passage that greatly resembles a passage from Warning. Moreover, the title Fairies is written below Warning on the first album's session log sheet. I consider these 4 songs to be a part of their earlier, more overtly blues-based style. To illustrate their shift away from this style, I will now share an excerpt of a live performance of a pre-album version of Into the Void, which reveals an extra verse with several blues inflections in Osborne's vocal melody. It is notable that this verse was removed, and that those blues inflections were not included in the other verses on the studio version. In live performances that summer, guitarist Tony Iommi would play this blues shuffle-style riff. The non-blues sounding material from this part of the song ended up on their 1972 album, These Two Chords. But it is notable that the blues shuffle riff was abandoned, and that this other blues-style riff was reworked to the point that its connection to the blues was lost. From 1969 to 1971, Black Sabbath gradually increased the regularity and prominence of stylistic elements of heavy metal and progressive rock, whilst diminishing their roots as a blues band. Although the terms heavy metal and progressive rock were not used as genre labels at the time, we can retroactively recognize that Sabbath's musical idiolect exhibited qualities of both, with heavy metal emerging as the prevailing musical style. Thank you for listening.